Now, in this first video, we're going to discuss how selling has dramatically changed in the economy that we live in today, which many experts are calling the new economy. So the question does have to be asked. Does the consumer of our time, do they buy the same way? Do they think the same way? Do they have the same buying behaviors that consumers did 10 years ago? Or let's say 20 years ago in the 1990s, or maybe even 30 years ago in the 1980s. Now, most of you would probably agree that today's consumer buys completely different than they did 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. But why? Why has the consumer changed, though? It's actually very simple. I want you to think about it for a second. 20 plus years ago, what was the bridge between the company and the consumer? It was, of course, the salesperson, right? The company would send out the salesperson to educate the public about their products or services. And besides radio and TV, this was the way that the consumer really learned about the company primarily. But now in our age, in our time, with the power of technology and the ease of the internet, and especially social media, we live in a completely different era. Why? You see, the consumer knows all about your company. They know all about your products, your services, your pricing, your competitors, how long you've been in business. They know everything about you by simply doing a Google search on their phone or their computer. And because of this power, they no longer will be manipulated by pushy salespeople because they know they have many other choices to choose the exact product or service that you sell. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's look at, let's say, the used car market. You see, in the United States today, a prospective customer of, let's say, a Toyota Camry can arm themselves with all manner of information before they ever stop under the dealership. She can go on the internet and find other dealerships who offer the same car within a certain radius of her home, which gives her a much wider range of choices to choose from. She can tap into her social media network or visit websites to discover each dealer's reputation and whether other previous customers were actually happy. She can visit online forums to see what current Camry owners feel about the car they have. She can check Kelley Blue Book or Edmunds or Auto Trader to find out the price that used Camrys are actually selling for. And once she sees a car that she actually likes, she can take the automobile's VIN number and with a quick online search, find out whether it's been in any accident or had major repairs done. So for the most part, she is protected from unethical sellers, which is good. But if she gets any dirty dealing from you, or if she ends up upset because you tried to push her or manipulate her, she can do far more than simply gripe to her best friend or neighbor. She can tell a few thousand of her Facebook friends, her Twitter followers, some of whom which will share their posts with their social media friends, completely undermining the seller's ability to sell. Now, just extend the realities of the market for used cars to just about anything that's sold. So for better or for worse, consumers now view salespeople much like the prototypical used car salesperson. So whether you're talking about your products or your services, your company or anything, most consumers think that you have an ulterior motive, that you're out there to manipulate them into buying something that they don't want to buy. They think you're going to overpromise and underdeliver, or you're going to cherry pick statistics to try and prove your point on why they should actually buy from you. So this is what you're going up against every single sales call you make, every door you knock on, every prospect you're talking to, every day of the week, every month of the year. So now the other question is, does a salesperson in our time, do they sell the same way the salespeople did 10 years ago? Do they sell the same way they did 20 years ago or even 30 years ago back in the 1980s? Ask yourself this question. Do you use some of the same sales techniques like these? Were you taught that you have to assume the sale? Were you taught the ABCs of closing, that you've always got to be closing? Were you taught the feel, felt, found theory when trying to overcome objections? Were you taught how to do long presentations and sales pitches or asking questions to get them to say yes a certain period of time? I call those manipulative questions. When you're closing, do you use the trial close or the demonstration close, the puppy dog close, or the option close? I mean, there's like 1,000 different closing styles out there. Do all those sales techniques sound familiar to you? Most of you would say, yeah, that does. Why? Because you read about them in business magazines and traditional sales books. You see things like you got to focus on, closing the sale. You've got to You've got to be strong. You've got to overcome their objections. You've got to be relentless. You've got to be thick-skinned. You've got to accept rejection as a normal part of selling. You've got to chase the sale until they say yes or no. You've got to be, so excited about your products and services and show your excitement to them that they're just going to be excited and buy from you. And here's my favorite one. It's a numbers game to get to as many no's as you can to get that yes. Now, let me give you an example of a sales trainer who uses the old model of selling, traditional selling techniques. And I want to preference this. I have nothing personal against this person. I'm sure he's a great person. But when I see what he posts and how he writes about his training, I know that he still uses the old model, traditional selling techniques. Now, this person calls himself the hardcore closer. And he actually sells different sales training programs and lead generation systems for realtors, mortgage brokers, different funnels. And actually, when you look at his products, some of them are actually pretty good. What would be the first thing that came to your mind if a salesperson called the hardcore closer was trying to sell you something? What would come to your mind? Well, probably this guy's a pushy salesperson. He's just trying to close me, hence the hardcore closer. You see, the hardcore closer says that if you fill out your information on his website, and I'm just quoting him here, he says, all I ask is that you come ready to invest and not waste my time. We have a lot of people to help, and we want to help those who are ready first. So basically what he's saying is, you better buy from me when I call you. You see, that's a typical posturing technique, pretty much called boiler room selling. If you've ever watched the Wolf on Wall Street show, that's how they sold in those days. And it might have worked back in the 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. But the only issue is most people in our day and age would automatically look at him as just another pushy salesperson who's trying to stuff his solution down their throat. And then what happens? Well, when you're pushy, they do what? They get defensive. The walls come up. They throw out objections. They hang up the phone, and many probably don't buy. Did you know that according to a recent survey on salespeople in North America, that 82% of salespeople do not feel comfortable using traditional selling techniques, and they do not feel comfortable with them being used on them? It's crazy. That means 8 out of 10 of you watching this video right now, according to this survey, possibly feel uncomfortable using traditional selling techniques that you probably have been taught, but what I call the old sales gurus. Why is that though? Why do most salespeople feel uncomfortable? Because traditional selling techniques go against everything we know about building successful relationships. Just think about it. If you were trying to get someone interested in dating you, and all you did was talk about all the great things that you had to offer them, your features, you only focused on you and your agenda of getting them to do what you wanted them to do, you didn't really listen, you weren't present, and you tried to pressure them into going on a date with you, what do you think would happen? Well, they would, of course, turn you down. They would reject you, of course, right? I would suggest to you that most of what we think we understand about selling is constructed atop a foundation of assumptions that have completely crumbled in the last 7 or 8 years. Completely. So the big question is now, if the consumer has completely changed the way they buy and react to salespeople, why hasn't the salesperson changed the way they sell, communicate, and actually caught up with that? Why do salespeople still sell like they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, even 40 years ago in the 70s, even though the consumer is completely different now than they were even 8 to 10 years ago? Well, it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to understand why. Let me ask you, what is the age of the average sales training guru that you buy your books and audio CDs from? What's their age? See, I listed some books here. These 6 books are some of the most popular books on the market right now. Now look at the ages. These men range from being in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Some of them have already passed away. And like I said, I have nothing against these old gurus. I'm sure they are great people. I'm just pointing out that they are still using the old model of selling, traditional selling techniques when they are training you. So what generation did these men learn how to sell in? Well, they learned how to sell all the way back in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. But the consumer was completely different then. Yet they're still teaching you how to sell like it's 1965 or in the 1970s or 80s. Let me give you an example of one of these old sales gurus. His name is Girard. In his book, How to Sell Anything to Anybody, he says in his book that he is the greatest salesperson in the world. And he actually has the Guinness Book of World Records for the most cars sold in a year, all the way back in 1963. Now, let me give an example of one of Girard's sales techniques that he's still teaching now from 1963. He says in his book, and I'm just quoting, if prospects mention they've recently been on vacation somewhere, I'm going to say I've been there too. Because wherever that guy's been, I'm going to tell him I've been there. Even if I've never heard of the place, he writes. They think they know a lot about me because I know a lot about them. If they say they've been to Yellowstone National Park, then I'm going to say I've been to Yellowstone. If they say they fished for salmon near Traverse City, Michigan, then I'm going to say I fished for salmon there too. If they say they've got an aunt who lives near the local Air Force base, then I'm going to tell them I've got an aunt that lives there too. So basically, he's lying. He's teaching techniques all the way back from 1963. Now, do you think using these type of sales techniques have caused consumers to not trust salespeople and look at you in an extremely negative way, throw out objections, become defensive, and ultimately reject what you're offering? And then how do you feel when that happens? Well, you know, lowered self-esteem, maybe a lack of confidence possibly. The funny thing is that Girard found that many clueless people to become the world's greatest salesman, and that he remains out and about teaching salespeople these same techniques might seem to validate that this type of selling still actually works. But there's one thing that you should know about Girard, aka the world's greatest salesman. He hasn't actually sold a car since 1977. You see, he quit the business almost 40 years ago to teach others how to sell. Girard's selling techniques might have worked in the mid-1970s, but in our time, they have the whiff of old, dusty boxes forgotten in the attic. But more broadly, his worldview and his selling tactics resemble one of those old movies in which a soldier who's stuck on a remote island continues fighting because he hasn't got the word that the war has actually ended. So what are the results of all this training? I mean, there's so much traditional sales training out there. What are the results it's getting you, the salesperson? Well, according to payscale.com, the average salesperson in North America makes $42,340.57 a year. Let me ask you, did you get into sales so that you could only average $42,000 a year? So the question is, do these selling techniques that you might have learned from the old sales gurus, do they actually work very effectively anymore in what many experts are calling the new economy? Now, if you're like many salespeople that I train every day, then you'd probably tell me that these old sales techniques that have been taught to salespeople for the last 30 to 50 years are actually triggering sales pressure that leads you to getting rejected and objections at every turn of every corner, leaving you feeling burned out, rejected, lower self-esteem, and worse, an empty bank account. You see, the average salesperson keeps using traditional selling techniques that don't work very effectively anymore in the new economy, while the seven-figure salesperson knows another way, a way that you could possibly learn as well. Now, I want to thank you for being on this video today. I'm going to be posting another video tomorrow about the post-trust era that we live in today, how that affects you as a salesperson and what you can do about it to get to the top 1% in your industry and get to that multiple six-figure, high six-figure, some of you a seven-figure income in selling every year in your industry. Now, I want to thank you for watching this video about how selling has dramatically changed in the new economy. Now, in the next video, we'll discuss about the post-trust era that we live in today, how that affects you as a salesperson, and what you can do about it to rise to the top salesperson in your entire industry. You're going to learn why trust is dead in the new economy and how you can become the trusted authority in your prospects' eyes. You'll also discover that if you continue selling the same way you've always sold, you're going to continue to get the same results that you're still getting now. And I can help you change that if that's what you're looking for.